it's a big topic. It's very near and dear to my heart that I've done for the better part of 20 years in the industry, medical device industry, as well as a consultant. At this point, I really wanted to kick today off with pointing out how this computational modeling and simulation is really becoming a revolution in the way that medical devices are developed, and the impacts that has, both in terms of from a company standpoint in terms of speed to market or improving devices, all the way through patient safety and the regulatory side of things, just briefly touching on those. I know that as we go throughout the day, there's going to be a lot of other speakers that are going to talk about specific examples, so I don't want to go too far into detail in any one of these areas, but as we get through some of these things, we'll have time for questions towards the end. So certainly add those questions to the chat, and we can we can start to address some of those as we get towards the end of the conversation. So, all right, let's see if I can advance this a little bit. Okay. So briefly, to start off with, as far as giving you a little bit of framework as to who we are and what we do. I, as a consultant for the last 4 years, have been working as a certified COMSOL consultant through a company called System Insight Engineering, where we focus on applying computational modeling and simulation to medical devices. So a lot of that is around the interaction between energy and tissue. So using those devices and applying and putting the model to what happens at the tissue level when we do that. Also, some hard tissue and orthopedics work is something that we're expanding into more recently. On our team, we have more than 60, probably closer to 80 years of medical device and simulation experience. And we use it across the board. We've used it in many of these different areas that you see here on the screen. We use it for virtual prototyping, optimization, some of the things that we're going to talk about today, data visualization, and of course the regulatory side as well. So the big question is, what is it that we're trying to do? Why bring computer modeling and simulation into the space of medical devices? As people that work in this space, you'll know that it is very traditional and risk averse with good reason. Being a regulated environment, as well as dealing with patient safety and having devices that are used on fellow human beings. Obviously, we don't want to take unnecessary risks in that space. The question is really, why would we bring a new technology or a newer capability into that space? And this has really been a dream of those that have worked in that space for a long time, and is really now just coming to fruition in terms of capability, and intersection of a number of things that we're going to talk about. But really what we're trying to address is, traditionally, we've always used in vivo and in vitro tissue testing for developing new medical devices. So when you would come up with a new idea, you would make some assumptions early on, create a device, create an energy source if it was that type of a device. And I do apologize. Most of my examples are going to include energy, because that's been my whole career has been around that energy tissue interaction. But there are lots of other examples as well, from the structural heart and cardiovascular space and stents and all sorts of things that are developed in a similar way, have similar advantages with medical devices, but really, my area is more on that energy tissue interaction side of things. So that's where a lot of my examples are going to come from. But we're trying to do that. So we would come up with an idea, we would build a prototype, we would take that to the lab. Probably originally it would be just some bench testing with with some in vitro tissue, looking at things like a basic effect, trying to come up with a good model that we would be able to extrapolate to what would happen in humans. and then you'd learn from that. You'd build a new prototype. You'd iterate everything. You'd try it again, and you do this enough times that eventually you feel very confident in the device. You move on to doing preclinical labs with an animal model, and then hopefully you would get to the point where you would accumulate enough evidence that you have a safe and effective device that you could take that to the FDA or other regulatory body and say, this is our new device. Maybe it's similar to something that's already on the market, so you're doing a 510K. Maybe it's not, so you're going down the route of getting an investigational device approval, something along those lines. But in general, it was always that interaction between building physical prototypes, testing them in a lab, and using that to generate the information needed to determine whether you had a safe and effective device. The problem with this is it's time-consuming and it's difficult. There's not always a one-to-one good model for these sorts of things. There's it's expensive. These models are certainly something that building prototypes, going to animal labs, all of these are expensive propositions. You certainly don't want to be wasting money there. And this is a difficulty. But the main reason is that when you start working with biological tissue sources, you suddenly have a very noisy data source. So the ways to overcome that, if you're looking at very subtle differences in the design changes for your device, as in terms of whether A or B is better, it's very difficult to determine if you're using biological tissue as your testing medium, because that's where a lot of that noise is introduced, and just the fact that you've got this variation in tissue between animals, between tissue sources, between time of day, how much hydration there is, and whether it's been sitting out, what the treatment of that tissue's been over the since harvesting. There's a whole bunch of things that go into that, and I mean we've seen as high as 30% variation in sources, just in porcine renal artery sources, even when we control the things like animal and side of whether it's a right side or left side and anything else we could think of, and really left with about a 30% variation that we would have to deal with. The other challenge is on the innovative product development side. So it's one thing to take an existing device that you know very well and expand it into an adjacent market where you're changing very few things about the way the device works. But if you're really trying to change the way that patients are treated and you really want to move the needle on improvements, a lot of times you're diving into spaces that are unknown. And there's a lot of things that you don't know going into that. And in fact, as Donald Rumsfeld said, is famous for saying during the first Gulf War, there's a lot more unknowns. Things that we don't know, things that that we're going to have to figure out, but aren't on our radar early in the process. And so, out of these unknowns and the unknown unknowns, is really we end up with some very vague specifications, some very wide areas where these things might cause, what in order to prototype across that whole area, they're going to cause a lot of challenge, because maybe for an energy source, you're not sure if you're looking at something that's 10 watts or something that's 100 watts, and for an energy source, that's a big difference. In terms of whether it's electrosurgery or whether it's the design of the handpiece, or whether it's a laser or something. That order of magnitude difference is something that is going to have a significant impact on the way that you can solve this problem. And you don't know that up front, because this is truly something that's not been done before. And every time you go in to do testing, it highlights more of the things that you don't know. So you come out of those tests with more questions than you have going into it, and so the progress is delayed, and there's becomes more expensive. And every one of those tests comes back with, well, we learned this list of things, but we also now have questions about this list of things. And those are real challenges around innovative product development. And that's really something that we have to be aware of, because as we go through new into areas where we want to really change the way that patients are treated, these new devices are going to are going to be the ones that have the biggest impact, and these are the ones that we want to encourage and find tools to make that development easier. because right now, medical device industry is certainly under pressure to keep the development costs down, to do more with less, as the case may be. At the same time, still providing world-class treatments to patients, and obviously not impact patient safety or really effectiveness of the treatment. So it all boils down to knobs. This is the analogy that we've used over and over again. As technology progresses, as processing power gets better, as sensors get more sensitive, and the options we have as engineers to develop new devices get more and more enabled, we have more knobs that we can turn. Electrosurgery is a 100-year-old technology, but 100 years ago, a lot of these things were uncontrolled that today we can control on really a pulse-by-pulse basis, which for electrosurgery is about 1 million times a second. So we can easily sense at that level. We can easily control at that level. But what that does is it provides us with a lot more knobs that we can turn in our devices in order to provide the outcome that we want at the end. And what computational modeling and simulation can do is help you focus on the knobs that are going to make the biggest difference. So really help you see where it is that these things need to be set, which things can be sort of ignored, set and know that they're not going to have a big impact, and you can focus on those things that are going to make a big difference. So the more the technology progresses, the more we're going to see that set of knobs increase. But using tools like modeling, simulation, and COMSOL, we're able to really bring that to a level of manageability when it comes to the design space for those devices. Other challenges that we have are really around the cost. Everybody's under those cost pressures. We want to reduce the amount of preclinical and animal labs that are performed. The data collection requirements and the patient space that you need to investigate. From an FDA standpoint, those requirements are getting larger, so that you are sure that you're putting something into the field that's a safe device. But it really also causes an increase in costs for that testing. So preclinical data collection costs are going up at like 15% a year on average over the last 5 years. Those costs are independent of any increase in testing or increase in complexity of the thing that you're trying to evaluate. So this is just, if you were to test the same thing, year over year, you would expect to see those costs go up about 15%, which is a huge, development cost over the course of a medical device development that could span easily 2 or 3 or 4 years. On the other side, we want to know more about our devices earlier in the process. From the Systems Engineering Handbook, we've got this example here, where even at the concept phase, where we've really committed through 8% of the design itself, a lot of the decisions that are made are upwards of 70% of what's eventually going to go into the device. So decisions are being made at the concept phase that are really going to drive about 70% of what that device is going to look like, even though you've kind of tested more along the lines of 8% of that performance. And the further you get through that system, the more those costs go up. So from concept to production, you can have a 1,000-fold increase in cost to fix some of those defects. As anyone that's ever had to go back and retool production tooling knows, those are obviously things that you want to avoid. It's a painful process, of course. So one of the things that modeling and simulation can do is give us more informed decisions at the concept phase before we've built those prototypes, knowing early on whether or not this device is going to work before we start building those physical prototypes, and know that that's the space where this thing is, it's going to perform as we expect across the range of patients that we expect, and we really go into it with a lot more confidence, and our testing becomes less of an exploration and more of a confirmation. And of course, there's the economic opportunity for for a device company. So you know, every device has a ramp up from the time that it's launched, and it certainly has the decay of the obsolescence. But if you are able to launch your device a couple of months earlier, that adds a couple of months to your peak sales in the middle, which can have a significant impact on the NPV and the resulting you know, financials for a specific device. That, you know, and the same goes on the other side in terms of the cost of delay. But if we are able to leverage modeling and simulation early in the process, we end up getting to market faster, having a few more months at those peak sales, you know, even as much as a year more at those peak sales if we're able to, you know, launch, you know, up to 50% faster. And those are huge numbers in terms of economic impact for the companies that are making those decisions. And it's not just about the revenue, because that then also opens up the possibility of working on devices for patient populations that weren't economically feasible before. So now some of the more rare disease states, we are able to apply, you know, knowledge and build specific devices for that space when that wouldn't have been possible before, when you had you know, when it would have just cost too much to build the device the traditional method, and the patient population wasn't large enough to really support that kind of decision. So those patients would have had to been treated with something that was some sort of a compromise. So that's maybe a device that was designed for a different disease state that was altered or approached in a different way for the issues that they had. In this case, if you start using modeling and simulation to get these devices out faster at a reduced cost in terms of development, it opens up that opportunity to build devices specifically for those rare disease states, and we're able to build more that's specific to help those patients, which results in something that's more effective and something that's certainly safer for that population as well. Okay, so we've talked an awful lot about the landscape and why it is that modeling and simulation changes some of these things. Now we're going to talk about the simulation side itself. So some of the things that really are going to be that change, that revolution that we have that's coming forward in the simulation world by using multi-physics simulation in medical device development, and what these sorts of what this revolution really looks like in terms of different aspects of that development. A big one is optimization, whether we're talking about topology and shape optimization, or you know, looking at design tolerances and things like that. Really, it allows us to make a lot more informed decisions and explore a lot more of the design space. You know, unfortunately, being cost constrained, you know, traditionally you're not able to test every possible combination of a device before picking the best one. Often you build prototypes and modify prototypes until you get to one that, you know, meets the criteria, but it's certainly not the optimized version. So this opens up a whole new world of being able to test a wider range of devices, you know, in a much faster manner. You know, investigate, you know, thousands of different design iterations over a month instead of, you know, 5 or 6, and that really gives you a lot more information about the design space that you're working in, what the interactions are between the different aspects of what's going on, in terms of, you know, the types of tissue that you would be interacting with, the types of settings that you use on the device, and all sorts of design changes in the device itself, whether those are materials or geometries or anything else. It certainly allows you to define that product development space early on. You know, when you've got the brainstorming results from early conversations, you can start to screen those results using simulation and make decisions based off of something more than just feelings or guesses. You know, really give you something to back that up. Because as you have a lot of these interactions, it's really hard to guess which of those competing interactions are going to be the dominating factor in the performance of the device. So it's much better to simulate these things and look at a range and look at that performance that's predicted there, even with a lower fidelity model, before you start making decisions about which direction to go from, from the brainstorming session where you had, 6 options, and now you need to narrow it down to 1 or 2. And then one of the more powerful sides of things is the Monte Carlo simulation. Tissue and that variability that we were talking about early on, that's a challenge for devices in testing physically. That can be evaluated, that variability can be evaluated using Monte Carlo simulations on the computational modeling side by varying the inputs across the distribution that for the various tissue types, for the tissue thicknesses, for many of the different tissue properties that go into that, and the expected use of the device. And then you can follow that all the way through to the predicted performance in the model and say, this variation in tissue properties up front will result in a performance variation, on the clinical side that looks more like this. And that really brings us to the range of performance that we would expect to see in a device, which is a lot more like what happens when you test, multiple samples in physical tests. So you get a range of performance there. We also then can look and see that same range of performance on the modeling side by being aware of how those inputs really change. So you can get a lot of the same information and be able to narrow it down earlier in the process before you start really investing a lot of money in those prototypes. As an example, we have put together how the jaw shape for a hemostat style device that where we're really trying to minimize the mass, the thermal mass of that device, or we're trying to minimize the structural components to this device, both from a thermal side and from a visualization side. But we also want to make sure that it's not too flexible in terms of those jaws flexing and touching each other, and shorting that type of advanced bipolar device, shorting that out. So here's a really short video of kind of explaining how that process works with an example that's really a very simple example in terms of how you would use optimization. So as I was saying, this is kind of a balance between the two, between your performance in terms of structural flexibility and also minimizing the amount of material that is in the support structure itself. So with simple simplifications along most of the jaw surface except for the support, we're able to run through multiple iterations of what that support would look like, and really come up with a shape that it's really unlikely that you would have come across on your own. If you just left a designer to come up with a dozen different designs, it may have been something close to this, but it certainly wouldn't be the optimized design that where we push the limit as much as we could in this space. So that's just kind of an example of how one would use the optimization to do some of that work. And of course, as we look at some of these different inputs and do the Monte Carlo side of things, or we start looking at the outputs in terms of the optimization, you really start to map through the model how sensitive that model is to specific things. So you learn where the major drivers are, and you get to filter those knobs down to the ones that really matter in the end. For this type of an application, there may be dozens of different inputs that potentially could have an impact, and you're able to narrow it down to 4 or 5 that are really your major design changes that are going to move the needle in terms of that performance on the end of the device. Another reason that just to kind of shift gears a little bit more here and talk about the technology behind computational modeling and simulation. Another reason that this is now kind of the forefront of this revolution is that it used to be, in order to do a lot of this work, it was custom code that you had to do in order to do the multiphysics types of simulation, whereas a lot of that is built into COMSOL now. And it used to be that you had to have your own, clusters or supercomputers. This is why places like IBM were at the forefront of some of this research, because they had, the computational power to do these things. And the challenge there really is having in-house experts that understand how to put together those clusters or how to maintain those computing systems. And there's a lot of IT overhead that most companies don't have. Even large medical device companies, it's not that common for, unless the largest around, for them to have a lot of that high performance computing experience in-house. So this was the reality where everyone was working until recently, where we start to use a lot more cloud resources, where you can use things like Rescale and Zscaler and Amazon Web Services and start to leverage their knowledge to maintain their own data systems. And really, we're just renting the computational power when we need it. So that's made a huge difference in the size of the models that can be run, the complexity and the interactions that can be addressed. There's fewer simplifications that you have to make in terms of, you can look at more of those multi-physics interactions. You can look at more of them in terms of 3D. You can look at them with finer resolved meshes, all sorts of things that will really drive those degrees of freedom up in those models, and you have the resources available to get those answers back in a reasonable amount of time. My personal benchmark for that is, I really want to get the answers to a model back before I forget what it was that I changed from the last time that I ran it. So certainly these cloud resources help you do that, because a lot of these models, when run even on the most powerful local workstations, can end up running for days or even upwards of a week. And if you've got many different iterations to get through, it's much better to put that onto a cloud resource where you can leverage a lot of computational power, parallel processing in terms of solving a bunch of them at the same time, and get those answers back in a reasonable amount of time, and get answers back in hours or days instead of weeks or months. Because when you start getting into the months time frame for running a lot of different iterations of a complex model, you're getting into the time frame where you can start building prototypes and things like that. But you're not saving nearly as much time as you would like. And one of the last that I want to talk about is on the precision medicine side of things. What's really going to change a lot of treatments for patients is that precision medicine, or the other way it's referred to in terms of, is personalized medicine, where we're able to take into account the specifics of a patient. In this case, we're looking at renal denervation, where maybe the renal arteries of a patient have very specific shapes, and we know where the nerves are, or that the nerves are in a different space rather than the typical case, and we can change the cooling and the energy delivery to match that patient, so that we're protecting that renal artery while still targeting the treatment, which is in this case those renal nerves, wanting to go in and ablate those nerves to help treat hypertension. This allows you to really look at a wider range of patient populations, and one of the things that really helps to revolutionize the way that we're evaluating devices going forward is it allows you to look at disease states, whereas a lot of bench and preclinical testing is done in healthy tissue. There's not nearly as much done in terms of disease tissue as in terms of what's happening in these arteries. Is there plaque buildup? Are there other diseases that are changing the thickness of those arterial walls, or otherwise impeding our ability to get energy into the space where we need it? You can start to look at those things and start to plan that way for both for an overall device capability, as well as for a specific patient that you may have this going forward. It allows you to, using computational modeling and simulation, it really allows you to evaluate, many more concepts than you would ever be able to build. Gives you more information about the performance of those devices, rather than having to just kind of guess up front whether this is going to be better or worse. Like I said before, there's a lot of interactions here that's hard to just think your way through instead of running the simulations to show the performance difference between A, B, and C. It's much better to do that all obviously on the simulation side rather than making those guesses and just pulling the design early in the process without that information. And it's really useful across the entire development process, from the earliest ideations where we're doing virtual prototyping, looking at performance and optimization through the concept phases. In the feasibility side of things, a lot of this is done to look at variations in the alignment of devices and things, to look at manufacturing specifications, root cause analysis. Visualizations are a big one because the data visualizations for how a device works in a particular case are very powerful to show, to explain to non-technical staff or to customers in a very quick manner in terms of being able to show, like the video that we showed earlier was really just about visualizing how does this moving mesh that may be a hard concept to really talk your way through to show those sorts of things and visualize that data for a medical device and how it works. Where does the energy go? What does the current density look like? Those sorts of things become rather key in all of that. And then, towards the launch, there's the regulatory evidence side of things as well, where we've got the guidance document from the FDA. You have the V&V 40 standard to help, work on the credibility and the validation of those models. And so between those two, you have a very good framework of what on the regulatory side, what's expected in terms of developing those devices, testing those devices, and doing your verification and validation. And the caveats that get thrown into every presentation I do, this isn't a magic bullet that's going to solve everything. There's two things that you have to do. Every simulation requires that you do experimental validation and convergence tests. The pretty pictures that come out of the model are only useful if you can tie them back to the physical tests. And we can't model what we don't understand. So with physics-based models, they have a lot of opportunity and a lot of advantages. But if you don't understand the physics of how your device works, which we've run across more than once, it's very difficult to build those models to answer those types of questions. You can build black box models, but they're a lot less useful than doing similar things with physics-based models. So, because you do have to investigate the whole space or have data across the whole space in order to build that black box model, and it's difficult to extrapolate that into the areas surrounding your design space. So, with that, the last couple of points really are, we've got a lot of innovation coming and better performing devices because of computational modeling and simulation, and it's going to be an enabling technology that's really going to change this industry in ways that we've not ever seen before, resulting in safer and better performing devices that reach the market faster, which is really what we're all after for sure. So my contact information is here. Feel free to reach out in terms of email or through our website to get further information.